Hi there. Welcome back to this crazy genealogy ride. You may notice my voice is a bit gravelly. I'm recording in the wee hours of the morning with my coffee on the warmer, candles burning, and my little hellion kitty snoozing on the sofa. In the last episode of This Nature, we discussed the Vanir as an elemental line at length. So now that we've hit all of the elementals, let's go back to Ymir's line. I don't think I need to reintroduce you to how Ymir arrives on the scene. If you missed it, I discussed that during an earlier podcast in depth. All we need to remember at this point is that he is here and is the original primordial being. From Ymir, we can separate the genealogy into two distinct lines. We have the Jötnar and we have the dwarves. Some of you were expecting me to say something else. We'll come back to that other line later, I promise. To keep us from getting tangled too early, I want to start with the line that's shorter in terms of textual genealogy, not importance. The dwarves. According to the sources, when Ymir was killed and dismembered, beings were seen forming within the substance of his remains. The imagery is blunt. The text described them as creatures emerging from decay, similar to maggots, which tells us more about Norse comfort with transformation than anything else. These beings were then shaped into humanoid forms, and this is where the dwarves enter the cosmological picture. There appears to be some discussion between scholars Sigurd Nordahl, Ursula Donkey, and even Sophus Bugg on whether the dwarves formed themselves from Ymir's remains, out of Brimir's blood and Blaine's bones, or whether the gods formed them. I'm of the opinion they were already forming, and maybe the three brothers, Odin, Vili, and Ve, simply shared that same idea of breath, fair complexion, and spirit as they did with humans later on. Sort of the best of both ideas. One thing that's worth clarifying early on is that the sources don't treat dwarves as a uniform physical type. This is why later fantasy ideas about dwarf appearance don't really help us here. Function and placement matter far more than size ever did. What matters far more than how they look is where they dwell and what they do. We will need to set aside any preconceived notions of stature, something that also holds true when we're reviewing the Jötnar later. Dwarves are associated with hidden and subterranean spaces, not simply in the sense of being underground, but in a very specific cosmological way. The sources place them in Nidavellir, Nivavellir, a realm understood to exist within Svartalfheim, situating them inside the darker, unseen layers of the Norse cosmos. This positioning is meaningful. It places dwarfs where form is decided before it ever becomes visible. Structure is settled long before it reaches the surface, and that, to me, strengthens the argument I've made before, that dwarves and Svartalfar are not the same beings, even if later traditions blur them. From that position, their association with craft and skill becomes much more than a personality trait. Dwarves are consistently described as the makers of objects that alter the course of events, stabilize the world, or bind forces that would otherwise run unchecked. Their work supports the functioning of the cosmos itself, even when it happens out of sight. The influence they exert is quiet, but it is structural. Things hold together because of what is shaped in those hidden places. And this fits in with their own manifestation from Ymir's primordial energy-filled corpse. What the sources gives us next reinforces this idea in an interesting way. Instead of long, branching family trees, Voluspa preserves a catalog of names. This list does not function as genealogy in the usual sense. It establishes presence, responsibility, and scope. Many of the names describe qualities, movements, or relationships rather than ancestry, which shifts our understanding of what identity means for the dwarves. An example appears in the figures of Nordri, Sudri, Austri, and Vestri. The dwarves named for the 4 cardinal directions who are said to hold up the sky itself. This detail places dwarves squarely within the architecture of the universe. They are not only makers of tools and treasures, they are involved in maintaining orientation, balance, and structure on a cosmic scale. There are few attestations for dwarf genealogy, but the primary source is a long catalog of dwarven names in the Voluspa, a poem located in the Poetic Edda and quoted by Snorri in the Prose Edda. 2 main characters appear at the beginning of this catalog within a section of verses called the Dvergatal, and that's spelled Dvergatal. This is a long list of dwarven names that are simply grouped together rather than described as a line of ancestry. One of these characters is named Motsignir, M-O with an accent, T-S-O-G-N-I-R. In Voluspa, he is described as the greatest of dwarves, a figure set apart not by ancestry, but by authority. He is the ruler or the lord of the dwarves. I'm lingering on this because it tells us something important about how origin works in this cosmology. The dwarves don't begin with a family unit as we see in other lineages. They begin with a role. Motsignir's significance lies in his placement at the threshold between formation and order rather than any biological lineage. We have no predecessors, and nothing is said regarding children or descendants. Motsignir does not function as the head of a dynasty so much as the point of which dwarven existence becomes distinct and acknowledged within the cosmos. He marks the moment when these beings move from emergence into recognition. In that sense, Motsignir is less a forefather and more a stabilizing presence, the one who establishes that dwarves are. Immediately following Motsignir in the poem is Durin, D-U-R-I-N-N. You might recognize this name from The Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit books. Where Motsignir establishes dwarven existence, Durin appears to organize it. The phrase Durin's folk shows up in later interpretations, not to describe children in a literal sense, but to indicate a people shaped under his ordering. Durin's name itself carries connotations of endurance and persistence, which aligns well with how dwarves function throughout the mythic landscape. Steady, resilient, and quietly essential. Durin is the figure under whom the dwarves become a collective rather than a series of isolated beings. The long catalog of dwarf names that follows in Voluspa does not trace descent from him in a genealogical sense, but it does imply that identity among the dwarves is something conferred through belonging and role. To be of Durin is not to be his child, but to be part of the ordered world that arises from him. And this gives us a lineage of becoming rather than blood. So do we have anything that can structure a line of descent at all? Well, if we pull from various myths and sagas, we can put together some relationships that appear as familial. What we don't have is a clear line of how they all connect to an originator. I've tried to put together a smaller list of dwarves who have familial connections mentioned specifically, but please be aware that they do not come together as a whole, only as separate parts used in the storytelling. Rather than just repeat all the names mentioned in Voluspa, I'm going to limit my rendering of the dwarves to those with some sort of familial connection mentioned in the sources. I believe I do add 1 or 2 without this designation, but it will make sense later. Many of these names will make appearances in the myths, so discussing them is appropriate, I think. In no particular order or age, let's begin. And this is less a family tree and more a handful of snapshots. Oin, O with an accent, I-N-N, has a son named Andvari, A-N-D-V-A-R-I. Billingr, B-I-L-L-I-N-G-R, has an unnamed daughter, but no one else is shown as connected to him. Broker and Eitri, Brokkr and Eitri, and he's sometimes known as Sindri, Sindri, are listed as brothers, but no other links are mentioned. Dawing, and Nab are brothers, Da accent INN, and Nab, Nabb. Dvalin, Dvalinn, is mentioned in connection with Alfrig, Alfrigg, Berling, Berling, and Grer, Grer, but whether they were brothers is not specified. For our purposes, we will link them loosely together. Dvalin also apparently has daughters, who are considered minor Norns with a small n, but no names are given for them. Hreidmar, Hreimarr, is the father of 3 sons. Fafnir, F-A with an accent, Fnir, Regin, Regin, and Other, O with an accent, Tr, as well as 2 daughters named Lyngheiðr, Lyngheiðr, and Laufenheiðr, Lofnheiðr. Of note, this is the only place I can find thus far that lists female dwarf names. Fjalar and Galar are brothers associated with the magical mead story, Fjalar and Galar. We see a mention of a dwarf named Litr, Litr, in the lore surrounding Baldur's death. Spoiler alert, but nothing more about him. Alvis, Alvi with an accent, SS, is mentioned as trying to marry Thor's daughter, but no connections elsewhere. We can then tie it up with the Sons of Ivaldi, Ivaldi. Now, the common thought is that this Ivaldi is indeed the same as the one mentioned as a prominent player in the Ljósálfar. I believe the main discussion revolves around Ivaldi having more than one line of descendants, the Light Elves, this particular line of dwarves, and possibly some Jötnar. And these mysterious sons are never given names, just the title to group them. I find it interesting that they weren't important enough to be individually named, but they were prominent enough to mention as a group. I think I have everyone with some sort of genealogical link, but there is the possibility that others are hiding in the tales. As we dive into the myths later on, I will update my notes whenever we come across someone I have missed here. In the meantime, we should identify the dwarves as a whole, with only minimal mentioning of them as individuals. Identity among the dwarves is not anchored in who begat whom, but in what each being is responsible for shaping, holding, or maintaining. And from an animist perspective, that makes a great deal of sense. Names mark presence, presence implies obligation, and obligation creates relationship. So before we leave the dwarves behind completely, it's worth noticing the contrast they give us. Once we turn to the Jötnar, that changes. Giants are where the sources finally seem more comfortable talking about descent, survival, and continuity through lines, even if those lines are still incomplete and sometimes frustratingly vague. And that said, I want to be clear about how I'm approaching this, because this is one of those areas where modern heathens don't always agree. Some people prefer very strict source boundaries. Others are more comfortable with later scholarship, comparative myth, or personal interpretation. And what I'm doing here sits somewhere in the middle. I'm focusing on figures who have some kind of anchor in the surviving myths. A story, a relationship, a clear reference, and building outward from there. There are almost certainly names I'll miss, and if they come up naturally later, we'll talk through specific stories. I'll fold them in where they make sense. Before we start tracing individual names, it helps to expand our understanding just a little and talk about what we mean when we say Jötnar in the first place. They aren't a single uniform group. The sources describe giants associated with frost and ice, fire and heat, stone and earth, water and the sea, or even air or storm. Some dwell in Jotunheim, J, O with an umlaut, Tunheimr. Others in Muspelheimer, MU with an accent, Spellheimr. Niflheimer, Niflheimr, or other liminal spaces. In other words, giant here is less about size and more about force. Jötnar tend to embody elemental powers, yes. However, these are boundary conditions and states of the world that are older than or exist alongside the gods themselves. A little different from the elemental line discussed previously. From an animist perspective, they function as personifications of natural forces that do not exist for human comfort, but rather for cosmic balance. And keeping that diversity in mind will make the genealogies easier to follow, because not every line moves through the same realm or expresses the same kind of power. So starting with the earliest part of the Jötnar line that I feel reasonably confident tracing, we come to Thrúðgelmir. Thorn, R-U with an accent, Eth, Gelmir. And Bolthorn, B-O with an umlaut, L, Thorn, O-R-N. Thrúðgelmir is usually understood as the son of Ymir and the father of Bergelmir. That central survival spine we'll come back to in a moment. Bolthorn is a little trickier. He appears as a powerful giant figure connected to wisdom and deep time, but the sources don't give us a neat placement for him in the same way. What we do get, however, are his children. Bolthorn is named as the father of Bestla, B-E-S-T-L-A, and Mimir, M-I with an accent, M-I-R. The texts don't tell us who their mother was, and they don't clarify whether Bestla and Mimir share both parents or only one. Most reconstructions treat them as siblings, and for the sake of clarity, I do as well, even though the sources themselves remain silent on the details. That kind of ambiguity is pretty common in giant genealogy, and it's one of the reasons different heathen traditions map these lines differently. Mimir is, of course, strongly associated with wisdom, memory, and the well that bears his name. There's also a brief reference to Mimir having 7 sons who play at Ragnarok. No names are given, no domains are listed. Even the word sons may not mean biological offspring in the way we tend to assume. Old mythic language is slippery like that. It reminds us that these stories weren't written to answer our questions. They were written to hold meaning for individuals already familiar with the myths. And this is where I want to flag a moment of UPG. If Mimir did have offspring, I like to imagine them as forces tied to flowing water, brooks, streams, currents, something that echoes Mimir's association with wells, memory, and deep, slow wisdom. Water that moves but doesn't rush. And that image isn't in the sources, but I want to be upfront about that. You're welcome to keep it, discard it, or reshape it into something that fits your own understanding better. I offer it as a way of thinking with the myth, not as a claim about what the myth definitively says. This kind of association isn't coming out of nowhere, though. Across many cosmologies, water, whether moving gently or gathered in still, is tied to memory, wisdom, and depth of knowing. So while this image of Mimir's sons is personal, it's also working with a much wider symbolic pattern. It's possible that as we continue working through Old Norse material, we may even come across terms that express these ideas more precisely, the way names like skooma helped anchor earlier concepts. For now, though, I'm intentionally leaving this space of names a little open, both to avoid overdefining it and to make room for other interpretations. And that instinct to notice a pattern, sit with it, and try to understand how it might fit is something scholars have been doing with this material for a very long time. These same later scholars sometimes complicate things further, however. Victor Rydberg suggests that Mimir had a wife named Sinmara, Sinmara, while Henry Adams Bellows instead links Sinmara to Surtr, Surtr, the fire being associated with Muspelheim. Rydberg goes even further, connecting Sinmara with several nocturnal or liminal figures whose names you may recognize later. And whether those connections belong to Mimir's life, his death, or a much older layer of myth is unclear. The sources don't settle the question for us. This is one of those moments where Norse cosmology shows its seams or limitations. Relationships overlap. Names drift as figures move between roles. And whether you choose to give Rydberg's reconstruction much weight is entirely up to you. What can be said with confidence is that these myths were never tidy family trees. The way these beings intersect, separate, and rejoin suggests a worldview that was far more comfortable with fluid relationships than rigid charts. And that brings us to Besla, Mimir's sister, and one of those figures who looms large in implication while barely speaking in the sources themselves. Besla doesn't give us long speeches or dramatic scenes. Instead, she shows up at a crossroads where different lines, worlds, and kinds of beings intersect. I've already shared my personal theory about Besla's relationship with Njord and the possibility of Odr coming from that connection. It's not something stated outright in the surviving texts. I bring it up because it fits certain patterns we see elsewhere, but it's not something I'm asking anyone else to adopt. You're free to leave that entirely on the table or entirely off it. What is supported by the sources is Besla's relationship with Bor, Borr. Bor is descended from Adumla, the primordial cow who nourished Bori from the ice. Besla, a giantess, and Bor, a being emerging from that earliest divine line, come together at a point where the boundaries between Jötnar and gods are still very thin. This pairing matters, not just for who comes after them, which we'll talk about next time, but for what it tells us about the early cosmology. At this stage, the worlds are not yet cleanly separated. Giants and gods are still deeply entangled. Now, academically, Besla is often treated as a connective figure rather than an active agent, which I think undersells her role. She represents the ongoing permeability between the Jötnar and the emerging divine order. Through her, wisdom, memory, and giant lineage passes into later structures of power. Even without focusing on her children here, it's worth noting that Besla embodies the reality that gods do not arise in isolation. They arise through relationship, often through giants. That positioning makes Besla a quiet but essential presence in the mythology, which may be why she's easy to overlook. She doesn't stand at the center of a flood or a battle, but she stands at the meeting point of worlds. With Besla, we're looking at continuity through connection, that idea of survival and continuity happening through connection rather than conquest. And that brings us neatly to the next turning point in the giant line. Bergelmir, Bergelmir, and the flood that reshapes everything by moving towards continuity through survival. Bergelmir appears as the grandson of Ymir, son of Thrudgelmir, named in Vafthrudnismal as the one who lives through the great flood that follows Ymir's death. When Ymir is slain, his blood pours out in such volume that it drowns nearly all of the Frost Jötnar. The specificity of that grouping of Jötnar is important. The language in the sources is stark. This isn't a punishment, but a consequence. When something vast and primordial is unmade, the release reshapes everything around it. Bergelmir and his wife survive by climbing onto a vessel, sometimes described as a luder, L-U with an accent, eth-R, a word that can mean a wooden container or hollowed structure. The image is simple, almost understated. There's no grand arc, no divine instruction, no chosen status, just adaptation and responsiveness. It's life finding a way to remain in motion rather than be swallowed. And from an animist perspective, the flood reads less like a catastrophe imposed from outside and more like a natural force asserting itself. Blood becomes water. Water becomes boundary and transformation. And the world does not reset cleanly, it reorganizes. What survives does so because it can move with the current rather than resist it. Academically, Bergelmir functions as the hinge between the primordial Jötnar and the later frost giant line. The surviving sources do not list any specific names for progeny, only that he and his wife survive. We have to presume that there are future lines created from him, and that any of the other types of Jötnar not in the vicinity of the onslaught survived. It causes us to take a leap in order to move forward. We can take that leap by looking at what he represents. He is the point at which memory, lineage, and presence continue forward after the old world has been violently altered by his cousins. Heathen traditions often emphasize this as a moment of endurance rather than triumph. Giants do not conquer the flood. They persist through it. Bergelmir survives despite the destruction around him. Survival here is not about dominance. It's about relationship with force. The flood clears space, but it does not entirely erase the old powers. It carries them forward in altered form and through the future generations of Frost Jötnar. Seen this way, the flood becomes a story about thresholds. Old substance dissolves into movement. What was fixed becomes fluid. Boundaries that once held are undone, and new ones begin to form. It's not difficult to see why water becomes such a powerful presence in the mythology after this point, which brings us naturally to the next line we need to talk about. Once the world has been reshaped by water, it makes sense that beings who are water step more fully into view. Ægir, Ash, G-I-R, and Ran, R-A with an accent N, do not stand outside of the story. They emerge as the keepers of the sea itself, not as chaos, but as structure, hospitality, danger, and depth. After Bergelmir, water is no longer just a force that happens. It becomes a presence you must reckon with. Both Ægir and Ran are sea entities, not symbolic water, but the sea itself as presence and power. Ægir tends to appear as the more social of the two, known for hosting the gods, while Ran is associated with the dangerous, grasping aspect of the ocean, the one that takes rather than welcomes. And together, they form a complete picture of the sea as both provider and threat. Ægir has a son named Snær, S-N-R, whose name means snow. Snær appears separately from Ran in the genealogical material, and while he doesn't play a major role yet, he's worth noting because he connects sea and cold in a way that echoes later developments in the mythic landscape. He'll circle around later. Ran, meanwhile, is most often spoken of in connection with her daughters, the 9 waves. These daughters are not minor figures. They are named, active presences, and they appear together often enough that they function as a unit rather than as individuals acting independently. And these ladies have names that I struggle to pronounce. I will attempt to say it and then spell them out for you. Their names are traditionally given as Blodugada, B-L-O with an accent, Eth, U-G-H-A-D-D-A. Bylgja, B-Y-L-G-J-A. Dröven, D-R-O with an umlaut, F-N. Dufa, D-U with an accent, F-A. Hefring, H-E-F-R-I-N-G. Himmingleva, H-I-M-I-N-G-L-Ash, V-A. Hrun, H-R-O with an umlaut, N-N. Kolga, K-O with an accent, L-G-A. And Uther, U-Eth-R. They are most likely shapeshifters, able to appear in humanoid form at will or as waves themselves. And it's important to remember that waves are never truly separate. They rise and fall individually, but they are always part of the same body of water. That collective identity is key because I'm about to tie in my UPG in regards to Njord's son, Heimdallr, from our last podcast. The sources tell us that Heimdall is born of 9 mothers, but it's a little confusing as to who they are. My opinion is that the 9 waves are deeply involved in his origin. The lore doesn't specify this, and it definitely doesn't explicitly say how that works, which is where I come in. My personal interpretation is that the 9 waves are Heimdallr's biological mothers, not 9 separate pregnancies, but one unified event. Njord must encounter them at some point while swimming, maybe. Appearing in wave form rather than human form, the encounter with the leader of the Vanir is sensual and consuming. Heimdall is then conceived through their collective body. Throughout the pregnancy, the waves would have been forced to stay in their unified form, unable to access their shape-shifting nature. After his birth, the waves separate again, returning to their individual identities. One of my biggest reasons for holding to this theory is Heimdall's own shape-shifting capabilities. In the fight with Loki over Freya's necklace, he changes into the form of a seal, a creature primarily of water, but that can also navigate the boundaries between sea and land when necessary. That interpretation isn't stated in the text, and I want to be clear about that. I offer it because it fits both the language of the sources and the animist logic of water as a shared shifting body. You don't need to accept it for the rest of this to work. What is stated in the sources is that Heimdallr is connected to 9 giant women, and this is where the rest of my UPG theory comes in. In early Scandinavian societies, fostering created bonds as strong as blood ties, sometimes stronger. Being raised by someone mattered as much as who gave birth to you. The main reason I don't hold that they are his biological mothers is that they were different beings entirely. To be the child of 9 mothers in a more literal sense, those mothers would have to be joined together at some point. The Jötnar women named are not. The only way for it to make sense is if he is fostered to them. These 9 giant women live on the edges of the worlds, the outskirts of Midgard, the margins between realms. Only 2 of them are given a clear parental lineage. The rest appear without named parents, which places them firmly in the category of ancient elemental beings rather than neatly traceable descendants. And I will again attempt to pronounce their names and then spell them for you. Their names are Angaya, Angeyja, Atla, Atla, Isla, Eistla, Argjafa, Eyrgjafa, Imthr, Imedr, Jarnsaxa, J-A with an accent, R-N-S-A-X-A, Ulfrun, U-L-F-R-U-N, F-R-U with an accent N, and then Gjelp, G-J-A with an accent L-P, and Greip, G-R-E-I-P, who are explicitly listed with a father's name elsewhere. These women are often associated with earth and boundary energies within the Jötnar. They are not gentle figures. They are strong, dangerous, and rooted in the edges of existence. And that matters for Heimdall, whose role is literally to stand at the boundaries of the worlds. In this, his capabilities, as broad as they are, make sense. Of these 9 foster mothers, only Jarnsaxa is given children of her own in the surviving material. She is the mother of Magni, M-A-G-N-I, and Modi, M-O with an accent, L-I, sons of Thor. And that connection quietly links Heimdallr's upbringing to the next generation of divine strength, even if they never share a household. Before we leave the water and winter-adjacent lines entirely, there are 2 loose ends worth tying up: Snær and Ullr, U-L-L-R. To finish out Ægir's line, we need to account for his son Snær, whose name simply means snow. That's almost all the surviving material gives us. Snær doesn't come with a long list of deeds, stories, or relationships. He appears, he's named, and then he recedes again, which often signals an older or more elemental figure rather than a narrative one. And this is where I'm going to clearly flag another UPG alert. There is a figure elsewhere in the mythic landscape who fits remarkably well with what Snær represents, and that's Ullr. Ullr is strongly associated with winter, snowshoes, skiing, archery, and the hunt. He is not just a cold weather god. He is a god who moves competently through winter. Ullr is named as the son of Sif, who herself is tied to fertility, grain, and the harvest, but is also described as a capable warrior. It makes sense that Sif could pass on skill with weapons or hunting. What's less obvious is where Ullr's deep winter affinity comes from. From a purely source-based perspective, we don't know. Ullr's father is not named in the surviving texts. From a pattern-based perspective, however, Snær fits neatly. Snow, winter movement, cold weather survival, these domains overlap almost too cleanly to ignore. My personal interpretation is that Snær may be Ullr's father, arising from a relationship with Sif at some point before her marriage to Thor. Given how fluid relationships are throughout this pantheon, that possibility is hardly outrageous. This interpretation remains speculative, I know. Still, it respects what the sources do give us: names, domains, and recurring patterns of inheritance. Traits often carry across lines in Norse cosmology, even when the exact relationships aren't spelled out. It also helps explain why Ullr occupies such an unusual position in the mythology. He appears early, holds authority, and then fades. In some Anglo-Saxon material, Ullr's role overlaps with Woden, W-O with an accent, D-E-N, as a leader or oath figure, which suggests that his cult or importance may once have been much broader than the surviving Norse sources preserve. And whether or not one accepts Snær as Ullr's father, it's clear that winter, water, and survival are tightly interwoven here. Snow is frozen water. Winter is water held in suspension. Movement through cold landscapes requires skill, restraint, and awareness, all qualities shared across these figures. With that, the water-winter line can rest for now, and we can turn our attention toward another set of loose ends, Narvi's line, and what it tells us about night, darkness, and the cycles that frame everything else. The line of Norfi, N-O with an umlaut, R-V-I, sometimes called Narfi, N-A-R-F-I, and his close kin, Niptnara, N-I-P-T-N-A-R-A, are an interesting side branch. The sources aren't especially clear on Nip's exact relationship to him. She's described more as a female relative than a clearly defined sister. and notably, no children are directly attributed to her. The line we can trace with more confidence comes through Norvi himself. Norvi is named as the father of Not, N-O with an accent T-T, one of the most vividly described figures in the surviving lore. And before we move on, I want to pause on something that often gets smoothed over, ignored, or quietly edited out in modern retellings. And that's how Not is described. The sources don't just say that Not is associated with darkness. They describe her as svart, black, dark, swarthy. That is a physical descriptor. And what makes it especially notable is that we don't get skin color descriptions of goddesses elsewhere in the Norse material. This is rare and specific. I want to be extremely clear here. This isn't about mapping modern racial categories wholesale onto the past. That always gets messy. But it is about recognizing that Norse cosmology itself does not support the idea of homogeneous, pure, white divine lineage. The mythology already contains difference. It already contains contrast. It already contains bodies that do not fit the narrow image that modern white supremacist ideologies try to project backward onto it. Through Not, darkness is not treated as absence or corruption. It's generative. It produces earth through Jord, and through Jord it produces Thor, and which means that one of the most central figures in the mythology, the hammer-wielding, boundary-defending god so often claimed by modern extremists, is literally descended from night itself, from darkness, from a lineage that is explicitly described as black. The Vikings were not isolated. They traveled and traded. They encountered people across the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. The idea that Norse cosmology reflects a closed, racially uniform world is a modern fantasy, not an ancient one. The myths themselves resist that kind of flattening. So when I imagine Not, I don't imagine her as pale or translucent or vaguely shadowy. I imagine her as profoundly dark, a darkness so complete it absorbs light rather than reflecting it. She is so dark that she nearly disappears into night itself, set off by hair that is shockingly pale and eyes that catch light the way stars do, silvery, bluish, sometimes almost lavender. Her darkness isn't absence, though, it's depth, not frightening or exoticized, simply there, vast and generative, the kind of darkness from which worlds come. And when you follow that line forward from Not to Jord and from Jord to Thor, it quietly dismantles the idea of a pure divine bloodline altogether. The gods arise through mixture, crossing, relationship, and difference, which frankly makes the mythology stronger. This kind of darkness where form dissolves and edges soften, where vision gives way to intuition, is where Not resides. And in my mind, this is mythic night, not fear night, and it is breathtakingly beautiful. Not has 3 unions, each of which produces a child tied to a different aspect of the cosmos. Her first partner is Naglfari, Naglfari, with whom she has a child named Auðr, Auðr. The name Auðr is grammatically feminine elsewhere in Old Norse, which has led to a fair amount of scholarly debate. It's unclear whether this represents a lost linguistic distinction, a scribal issue, or an older naming convention that no longer survived intact by Snorri's time. Her second union is with Annar, Annarr, and from that pairing comes Jörð, J-O with an umlaut, R-Ev, the personification of earth. Jörð's story continues much later, particularly through her connection with Odin, so we'll set her aside for now. Not's third and final union is with Dalinger, whose name is associated with brightness and dawn. Their child is Dagur, day, who is described as shining and fair, clearly inheriting his father's luminous qualities. Together, Not and Dagur give us one of the clearest expressions of cyclical balance in the mythology. Night and day are not enemies here. They are kin, bound through lineage rather than opposition. And that largely closes the immediate line of night and day under Norvi's descent. But there's one more celestial thread worth tying in before we move on. Another pair of Jötnar connected to the heavens are Groa, G-R-O with an accent A, and Arvindil, A-U-R-V-A-N-D-I-L-L. Groa is a healer and spellweaver, remembered for her knowledge and magical skill. Arvindil appears briefly but memorably in the myths, most notably when one of his toes is placed in the sky and becomes a star, often identified with the pole star. Arvindil's connection to the heavens doesn't stop with that single star. His name itself likely derives from a root meaning radiant wanderer or light-bearing traveler, which already places him in motion across the sky rather than fixed to the earth. In Anglo-Saxon material, he appears as Arendil, E with an accent, A-R-E-N-D-E-L, a figure associated with the morning star or a herald of light, suggesting that Arvindil once occupied a much broader celestial role than the Norse sources alone preserve. Their son, Svipdagur, S-V-I-P-D-A-G-R, steps into the narrative later, particularly through his journey and eventual union with Menglod, M-E-N-G-L-O with an umlaut, Ev. Taken together, these lines give us a celestial pattern that isn't abstract. Night, day, earth, stars, healing, and time all move through Jötnar and Vanic ancestry. The heavens are not distant or sterile. They are familial, relational, and alive. Once you follow Norvi's line through night, day, and the heavens, it becomes clear that this isn't just about what moves across the sky. It's about the deeper cycles those movements mark, and that's where Norvi's remaining threads start to matter. Before we hand time completely over to the House of Mundilfari, I want to linger for a moment with Norvi himself, because what he represents is not quite the same thing. Mundilfari gives us measured time. He gives us the movement of mani and soul, the tracking of days, months, and cycles that can be named, counted, and regulated. That's time as something you can point to on a calendar or watch move across the sky. Narvi, on the other hand, feels older than that. Narvi is tied to night not as a phenomenon that rises and sets, but as a state that holds. Through his daughter Not, darkness becomes the container within which everything else happens. This is not time that advances step by step, it's time that endures. Time that allows things to grow unseen, to rest, to gestate, and sometimes to simply remain. And this makes sense because before time is measured, it is experienced. Before it is divided into units, it is felt as length, pause, waiting, and return. Norvi belongs to that layer. He doesn't regulate the heavens, he frames them. His line doesn't tell us how fast things move, but how long they last. This is why his descendants feel so foundational. Through Narvi, we get night, earth, and day, not as abstract concepts, but as lived conditions. Darkness gives rise to ground. Ground gives rise to growth, and growth eventually meets light. The cycle doesn't need to be clocked to be real. It just needs to continue. So when we talk about Narvi's wider connections, we're not really talking about timekeeping. We're talking about duration, continuity, and the deep rhythm that exists before anyone starts counting. Mundilfari's house will come in and give that rhythm structure later. Narvi gives us the silence underneath it. He holds the path for the celestial bodies, day and night, to take their journeys. He reminds us that Norse cosmology doesn't begin with order. It begins with experience. Order comes layered on top of something much older and much darker. Not dark as in harmful, but dark as in fertile, unseen, and necessary. One more thread worth touching before we move on is how closely Norvi's darkness aligns with memory and fate, rather than with time as measurement. In Norse thought, what is remembered is what continues, and what continues is what shapes destiny. Night becomes the space where things are held long enough to matter, where stories are kept, wounds are carried, and choices ripen before they surface. From that perspective, Norvi's darkness isn't passive at all. It's the condition that allows fate to take form, not through sudden revelation, but through accumulation. Memory gathers in the dark. Consequences wait there. And when something finally emerges into light, it already carries the weight of what has been remembered. Well, I think we need to hit the stop button here. There are still so many Jötnar to review and then into the main line of the gods themselves. And the more I flesh this out, the longer these podcasts seem to go. However, the deeper we go into explaining this now, the easier it will be to see patterns and possibilities in the myths later. My lovely little heathens and heathen friendlies, have a wonderful week as we count down the days of winter. Keep those layers on and cuddle those you love. Remember your connection to the divine, and with all the chaos going on in the world, don't forget to find your sacred breath.